After wringing off the rag and looking at her hands, the girl guessed that her limbs were very small and her grip strength was almost non-existent, as well as her stamina. Sighing desperately, the heroine wondered when she would grow up, but clenched her hand into a fist and resolutely stated that wringing out the towel would be much easier if she were a couple years older. Besides, according to the heroine, if she was older, she could have taken much better care of her grandfather. So, after remembering him, she decided to visit him. Peeking through the ajar door, the girl saw her sick grandfather with sweat digging from his face and put a cold towel to his forehead. We learn that 5 years ago, the heroine was a different person before she became Katisha Ainsley, and that day, Pi brought back her memories of her past life. It was a situation not unlike other rebirths, for she died in a car accident, and when she woke up, she was already in the novel she had been reading 2 hours before. The main character was lucky enough to be a commoner, rather than a villain, or a minor character who gets killed off immediately after appearing in the story. So now she was just a background that didn't intersect with the main characters. The girl was content with this life, for if we compare it with the previous one, where she was a poor orphan, here she was cared for in their cozy and small home. Unevenly clutching her dress, the girl assumed that her happiness would end today because her grandfather, Herzen, who had picked her up before she even got her memories back, was not well. From the girl's memories, we learn that her grandfather has always had a mischievous character, and she can't even imagine how difficult it was for him to raise a child. Even though the older relative made the heroine do chores when she got a little older and also made sure she did them, she still loved him. Suddenly, the heroine heard her grandfather's voice and ran up to him and asked him if he was awake, but he did not answer her question, but inquired if she had done everything he had asked. With an acknowledging look at her relative, the girl replied that his letter had been sent. In fact, she understood that there was a will there, but a week had passed and still no word from his family. The heroine was grossed out by the fact that her grandfather was sick, but no one showed up, so she excitedly grabbed his hand and he looked at her sweetly and said he was very glad that she was staying by his side at the last minute. Fearfully frozen in place, the girl wondered what he meant, for she did not want it to end, but, unable to contain herself, she cried. Now the heroine remembered that every day an older relative told her to pay with cleaning fees. But now this eternally grumbling, stingy grandfather has disappeared somewhere since he says such things. Looking at the crying little girl, the elderly man asked if she had thought about how she would live without him, to which she replied that she had no intention of doing so. The girl remembered that the interlocutor had promised her that he would go with her to the summer festival in a month's time and would also take her sledding in the winter. Crying even harder, the protagonist stated that if her grandfather continued to say such things, she would take his house and steal all his belongings, to which he agreed, explaining that she could take everything he owned. Guessing that the girl hadn't thought about life without him at all, Grandpa sighed sadly and explained that she shouldn't worry as he had prepared everything. Letting out a lifeless sigh, the old man told her that he didn't think there would be a more suitable person than the one he had found, but the girl wasn't convinced and declared that she didn't need anything because she wasn't just ready to part. She didn't want her loved one to leave her and began to beg him to stay a little longer, but he was unable to fulfill her request and asked her not to cry, promising that they would definitely see each other again. Sometime later, as she approached the coffin and laid flowers on it, the girl concluded that it was good that the neighbors had agreed to help with the funeral. Looking hopefully up into the sky, the heroine guessed that after the funeral, she would have to start thinking about what to do next. But for now, she hoped that her grandfather had gone to a good place and was going to meet him in 90 years. Suddenly, a strange guy came to the girl, calling her by name, which frightened her very much, because he came not alone, but with an escort. Smiling sweetly, the guy introduced himself as the Duke Vlasco's accountant, Jamian Parker, which confused the little girl, who hadn't expected someone from the Vlasco family to come to her. We learn that the Vlasco family is the infamous family of the Empire's only duke. Ignoring the consternation of his interlocutor, the lad read the letter, which said that they should carefully decorate the coffin and deliver it to the family's family cemetery in Artham. After reading the letter, the guy explained that they had come to collect the coffin according to the will of his lordship, the previous duke. So, after listening to his words, the girl realized that Herzen's grandfather was a duke. Noticing the interlocutor's excitement, the arrival explained that they had been ordered to take care of the coffin, so they were going to take it away, which they immediately began to do. Now the heroine turned her attention to the emblem of the Vlasco family and remembered that her grandfather had told her nothing about it, and she could not believe that such important guests had arrived. The guy also explained that the previous duke had left a will for her, and after taking out a piece of paper, he read the message that the money from his personal safe in the central bank, excluding inheritance tax, ownership of income from various territories, and works of art would be given to Lady Katisha. Upon hearing the boy's statement, the girl froze fearfully in place. She could not believe that at the age of 10, she seemed to have become a millionaire. Looking at the boy with disbelief, the girl asked if the inheritance would go only to her, which he immediately confirmed, explaining that the will is written in such a way that Lady Katisha becomes the sole heir. The main character could not believe that she would get so many things and that she might not be a millionaire, but a billionaire. Noticing the girl's excitement, the guy suggested that she visit the duchy to see the spirit of the hero and begin the process of inheritance, with which the girl, greatly embarrassed, agreed not immediately. Guessing that the protagonist was worried, the guy explained that the Duke was really looking forward to it, which surprised the girl, as she didn't expect to meet Duke Vlasco himself. We learn that although the Duke is considered the best swordsman and has held that position for 10 years, his character is tainted at the root. He is a capricious, irascible, and rude man that cuts off anyone who annoys him. It is also important that the Duke in the novel was the main villain who did not consider the main character, his adopted daughter, as a human being. Having guessed that they wanted to take her to the evil Duke, the heroine assumed that they had gone mad, so she immediately rushed to refuse, thanking the interlocutor for the offer. But he explained that she would get 1,000,000 gold in cash only. The interlocutor added with a grin that if the income of the territory were added, there would be an extra 100,000 every year. These words greatly angered the girl, who thought he was mocking her. Jumping off the table and looking at the guy with hatred, the heroine guessed that he thought she was a snob who would even risk her life for money. At the same moment, the girl, admiring the huge amount of money, still decided to agree, deciding that she was a snob, for she had had enough of the sadness of poverty in her past life. Noticing that her interlocutor had agreed, the arrival said that the heiress would receive half of the income of the information guilds, as well as the main house in Artham and a mansion in the capital. When she heard that she would receive a mansion in the capital, the girl froze with surprise, remembering that the capital's land is very expensive, so she could not hope that it would belong to her. The protagonist was happy because finally the dream of her own house from her past life became a reality, but the newly spoken guy, who never got a verbal consent from her, said that he was not going to convince her. And since the lady is against the idea, she will have to give up the inheritance. No sooner had the guy received a positive answer from the lady than she had already gathered her things and, rushing to the exit, declared that she was ready to go, so they should move out quickly. Sitting in the carriage, the girl came to the conclusion that she was not greedy, and she was just curious. So now it is worth forgetting about the bad character of the Duke and check the wealth. The girl wanted to find out if there were debts in the mansion and how the inheritance process works, but at the same moment, she was distracted by the guy asking if everything was okay, which she immediately confirmed, explaining that she was just tired and a little distracted. Guiltily lowering her head, the heroine asked her interlocutor what kind of hero spirit he was talking about, to which the latter replied that the hero spirit is a holy soul, which means that the soul of the previous head of the family is still alive and able to see, hear, as well as express his opinion. Now the heroine remembered that the spirit of the hero Vlasco was one of the details of the novel, and hundreds of years ago the first head of the family had sealed in the sword of the demon king that brought dark times to the continent. For generations, the Vlasco family had guarded this sword and made sure that the demon king didn't start raging. So it was a kind of two-way contract with him, with the demon king obeying the head of the family as long as he gave his soul to prolong the existence of the demon sword. Now the heroine has guessed that this contract implies that the head of the family becomes the hero's spirit after death and is bound to the sword. After approaching the girl, the guy told the girl that, in truth, the hero's spirit had already appeared in the spiritual tower where the demon sword was kept, which meant that she would be able to see her grandfather again. Remembering her cheerful relative again, the heroine confessed that she thought they would never meet again, but now she realized that she was not alone. Upon reflection, the heroine came to the conclusion that if her grandfather was the previous duke, the current duke must be his son, and now she remembered that the latter had mentioned his children. Sitting with the girl at the table, the grandfather told her that he had 2 sons, one of whom had left the world earlier, and with the second one, he had cut ties and left not to see him again because he was very stubborn. Now the heroine thought the grandfather's behavior was odd because it was usually children, not adults, who ran away from home, so she figured the relative had passed on the title and retired. However, despite the vast amount of detail, the girl did not understand why she was the sole heiress, so she asked the lad if her grandfather had left no property to the duke. Smiling sweetly, the interlocutor replied that on the day when the previous and current dukes quarreled, the former left, leaving only the title behind. But this tensed the girl even more, for she did not understand her position in the Vlasco family. Frowning, the little girl thought about how the main character was treated in the novel, and then remembered that the novel We Are Now, like magic, was the story of the suffering of the main character, Nila, who was adopted by the villainous Vlasco family. The protagonist of the novel was treated like a parasite, and her only chance to save herself was to surpass her brothers and inherit the demon's sword. However, she could not cope with the abuse and escape from the Duke's house. The protagonist left home to seek help from the White Cult, the only force that can stand up to Vlasco. And there, Niela met the main male character, the divine half-breed beast, Ikal. With the help of a new acquaintance, the heroine was competing with her family to inherit the demon's sword. So now the girl remembered that in the process, Ikal had been attacked by the demon's sword while protecting Niela. In the heroine's flashbacks, it was a novel about growing up over herself and experiencing being the true successor of the sword to save Ikal. But it abruptly stopped due to the serialization stopping at the most important point, right before the reunion of the main characters after being trapped. Deciding to focus on the current situation, the girl decided it wasn't that important, as the setting now was similar to the episode where Neela was made an adopted daughter. Thinking about it, the girl remembered that at that moment, the protagonist was told that someone dirty was walking around the mansion, and also, nothing here belonged to her, and she shouldn't even breathe their air. Back to reality again, the protagonist clutched her hands to her head, guessing that now, not only the son, but also the grandchildren are evil, and moreover, she is a stranger who has not a drop of common blood with them, and she owns 2/3 of the family's property. The girl realized that not only would she not wait for a greeting, but it would be good if she was not thrown away at once, for at worst she would be buried under some mountain. Turning to her companion again, the girl asked when she would be able to see her grandfather, to which the latter, after a little hesitation, replied that he had just become a spirit, so he needed 2 or 3 months to stabilize. Hearing not the most pleasant answer of the interlocutor, the protagonist guessed that she was finished, and she would sooner die under mysterious circumstances than wait to meet her grandfather. The Vlasco are notorious for having heads faster than their tongues and fists faster than their heads. They have an armed force under their control that is second to none, so the oddities of their character are simply ignored by most everyone around them. Several generations ago, this family had invested a huge amount of money in mining, iron production, and alchemy. So this and the family's technology allowed them to create high-quality weapons that were instantly sold out. Of course, as wealth and power grew, the voice of such a family grew louder and louder, and even the emperor couldn't do anything about it. Now the girl realized that she had been wondering just how rich and powerful they were, but it had exceeded her expectations, and now that she was in the mansion, she realized that it was an entire palace. Confused, the heroine decides that she needs to focus, because she has no time to be blinded by luxury, and now it seems she will have to fall at the feet of the Duke and refuse the inheritance because it is better than death. As the girl walked down the hallway with her escort, she remembered that she wished she had asked to be given the house where she lived with her grandfather, which she still hoped she would, because the Duke must not have killed everyone. When the men were near the doors, the protagonist's attendant informed the Duke that he had brought Lady Katisha Ainsley to him, so the Duke allowed them to enter, and the doors swung open. When the heroine entered the room, she saw the magnificent Duke before her and remembered that rumors said he was a man who could strangle a bear with his bare hands. The girl had actually imagined seeing a muscular bandit with a beard in front of her, but he was nothing like what she had imagined. He had beautiful sapphire-colored eyes, a sign of the Vlasco bloodline. With a disdainful look at the girl and turning to his assistant again, the man wondered if this child was the reason for that stupid will. Strongly embarrassed, but still choosing to bow to the Duke, the girl guessed that she had glimpsed his face, and afterwards wished that the defense of the demonic sword would always be their family's business. Now the heroine realized that the Duke should tell her to raise her head, but he did not, and she continued to stand with her head down for some time, and after that she could no longer straighten her back. With an irritated sigh, the Duke asked the attendant how old she was this year, to which the latter replied that the girl was 10 years old. So the elder concluded that she was the size of a palm. Looking at the girl with irritation, the Duke asked if her father couldn't feed her, adding also that she looked like a dried orange, and then asked her to straighten her back and come closer so he could look at her face. Following the Duke's order, the girl began to approach the man, but the man did not tell her to stop, and she realized that she would run into him at this rate. Looking down at the little girl, the man explained that he was curious to see what kind of sly fox she was. So now he asked Assistant Jem to put the guest on the table. Apologizing, the lad hurriedly followed the Lord's order, and afterward, when the girl was on the table, explained that she was now at a suitable level. Bringing his face close to the girl's face, Duke looked at her and noted her orange hair and green eyes, meaning she was definitely not a child of their family. Calling the heroine an orange, the man asked her to answer his questions only positively or negatively, so, instructed, the assistant asked her the first question. Noticing the astonishment of his interlocutor, the lad recalled that 10 years ago she had been planted with a note containing a name, and also with small lockets. And now he was concerned with the question whether it was true that Sir Herzen had taken pity on her and brought her up, which the latter immediately confirmed. Grinning, the man explained that he couldn't believe the old man was raising a child, and the confused girl guessed that apparently his relationship with his grandfather was indeed terrible, but it wasn't her fault and he should at least keep her alive. Noticing the girl's irritation, the lad asked her to calm down and not to look at the gentleman with that look, and then asked her if she had any other family than Sir Herzen's, to which she answered in the negative. After listening to the lady, the guy also asked if the previous Duke had talked about the inheritance before, but after thinking that the phrase, "I'll give you the house if you clean well," was not suitable, she again answered in the negative. A few moments later, the aide inquired if the previous Duke had left any items or documents that could serve as proof of her words, but the girl refuted that theory as well, confirming that he had left nothing behind. Fearfully frozen in place and once more convinced that her grandfather had left her nothing, the girl wondered why she was being asked such questions. But her attendant again drew her away from her thoughts and asked if Sir Herzen had spoken of the sword. Strongly frightened, the girl hurried to rephrase the question, but immediately, covering her mouth with her hands, she remembered that she was asked to say only yes or no. Taking up the papers which lay on the table, the Duke, turning to the girl, declared that he would now speak so that she should answer freely. The first thing he asked was whether she knew the name Gerst. Fearfully frozen in place, the heroine realized that the interlocutor was talking about their family's demonic sword, or rather, it was the name of the demon that was sealed in it, but it was unknown to the general public. After a little hesitation, the protagonist guessed that she couldn't tell what she had read about him in her past life, so she answered nothing. And the interlocutor, looking at her sternly, asked if she had inherited a relic of the Vlasco family and the entire Astrok Empire. Nervously shaking her head, the girl gave a negative answer, guessing that nothing should connect her to the demonic sword. But the Duke, looking at her with a challenge, asked her to explain the contents of the will. In fact, the girl did not know what was written on the piece of paper the man held out to her. So, after perusing it, she learned that her grandfather had bequeathed to her the estate of Herzen Vlasco and was also giving her the power of the rightful owner of the Sword of Gerst. As she read the will, the girl froze in place with horror and her hands shook as she remembered that Gerst was the family religion that was passed down to the head of the Vlasco family. Looking at the guest with hatred, the Duke guessed that her father had decided to give her the whole family, So now the poor woman realized that she was going to die for sure. But the interlocutor, who did not plan to give up, approached her closely and said that he wanted to hear her opinion about the whole situation. Noticing that the girl was crying, the Duke looked at her angrily and asked which one of them should cry if such a situation occurred. Embarrassed, the gentleman's assistant asked him not to shout like that in front of the child because the lady had done nothing wrong. But the man was only pissed off because he didn't realize whose side his companion was on. Getting angry, the aide explained that he was supporting the lady because she was very nice and he only cared about niceness, whereupon the interlocutors began to argue. After a while, the Duke calmed down and, painfully clutching his head, decided it was worth it to stop and people should leave. So now, approaching the girl, the boy explained that he would take her to her bedroom. When the lady was in the bedroom, the guy handed her a red pouch and explained that it was an emergency budget that the Lord had left behind, and to be more precise, there were 50 gold coins inside. When she heard how much money was in that small but heavy bag, the girl was frightened and froze in place, guessing that she could buy more than 1,000,000 loaves of bread with that money. Smiling embarrassedly, her interlocutor also handed her a locket, explaining that it was a kind of pass that the late Duke had used, and it was also linked to a vault in the central bank and it was locked for now, but she should keep it with her at least as jewelry. After examining the item she received, the lady guessed that it was like an exclusive black card in their time and it looked awesome, so she agreed to accept the gift. Kneeling down in front of the girl, the boy asked her to tell the servants if she needed anything, and reassured her that the Duke had a warm side, so she shouldn't get too upset by his words. With a delighted look at her interlocutor, the lady admitted that everything was fine. In fact, she was holding gold and a black card, so she simply couldn't have any problems. Left alone with her thoughts and collapsed on the bed, the heroine realized that these things are all right, but not the demonic sword, because its heir lives a short life. We learn that by curbing the sword, you can become the strongest sword master, but in the process, you lose your mind and become like a demon yourself. So before the soul is finally destroyed, the taboo of Vlasco kills the sword wielder. It is possible for a future heir of a demonic sword to stay alive from 10 to 30 years. Now the heroine remembered that they say Vlasco's successors are trained to survive for decades for the sake of it. Herzen's grandfather had a strong character and never borrowed the power of a demon, which is why he was able to live so long. But the heroine knew she was nothing like him at all and had zero defense. Now the girl guessed that if she was told to inherit the sword, she would be consumed by the darkness energy right at the ceremony, so she didn't have much time left. These thoughts scared her a lot, so she hurriedly crawled under the blanket. Having guessed that there was no joy in money if she died, the lady began to fidget on the bed, restlessly contemplating the future that now awaited her. The next morning, the girl burst into the Duke's room and informed him that she was giving up because she felt that inheriting the demon sword was too much for her. Exhaling tiredly and glancing at his guest, the man explained that they would have made a different decision long ago if it had been that simple, but the will had been probated at the Magic Control Office. When the Duke tried to tear the sheet of paper on which the will itself was contained, he failed, for the sheet was immediately restored, and he now explained that it could not be destroyed. Guessing that wouldn't work, the girl offered him another option. She wanted to accept the sword and then pass it on to someone else. However, this option didn't impress the Duke either, so he reminded her that there was a prerequisite to passing on the demonic sword, which was that she must die and become the next spirit of the hero. With a defiant look at her interlocutor, the man explained that if she wanted to die so badly, he would not stop her. But the girl also realized that this was not the best solution and refused this option. Having been rebuffed by her interlocutor, the man declared that she should then take it easy and wait patiently while he thought of what to do with her. Now that the conversation was over, the lady dared to inquire if the Duke would kill her. After a bit of hesitation, the Duke explained that her future depended solely on her actions, to which she immediately replied that she was useful in many things, such as cleaning, counting change, and she could carve swans out of apples. The interviewee's abilities didn't impress the man, so he explained that if she could listen and get along with people and didn't cause problems, she would even be given a chance to take the test. In fact, the girl did not understand the test in question, But her interlocutor did not want to continue the conversation and kicked her out of the room, allowing her to eat the grapefruit in the dining room. Once outside the door, the girl squirms in embarrassment and realizes she's going to die anyway, and the man offers to give her a tasty last meal in the process. As she came to her room and collapsed on her bed, the heroine wondered if her grandfather hated her so much that he had put her through such an ordeal. But immediately picking up the pendant she had been given, she remembered that it had been said that it had to have her name inside. Now the girl wondered what kind of people her parents were. However, remembering her grandfather again, she realized that she missed him a lot. So if she had known that everything would turn out this way, she would have at least prepared herself. Embarrassed, the lady covered her face with her hand and noticed that she was crying again for no reason. But at the same moment, her hand, which contained the pendant, became very warm. In that instant, the jewelry glowed so strongly that it made the girl take her hands from it. And she didn't realize what was happening, but at the same moment, the pendant opened and blinded her with an even brighter light. Opening her eyes and looking around in horror, the girl guessed that a second ago she had been in the bedroom, and now she didn't know where she was. So she started beating her fists against the wall and wondered if anyone was here. After a while, the heroine was able to open the door and realized she was in a box that resembled a coffin. However, when she lifted herself up and looked around, she guessed she was in a workroom. Having examined the room, the protagonist realized that it was furnished with modern things, and such things cannot be in the world of the novel, and in addition, in front of her was some flying thing, approaching to which she saw a bright light. When the heroine regained consciousness after being blinded by the bright light, she saw a sign that asked if she wished to continue. However, never realizing what the question was about, she answered in the affirmative. When the answer was given, the heroine was informed that she was going back to the 168th episode of the novel she found herself in, which surprised her a lot because the last episode was 167 and then the novel stopped indefinitely. Now, the heroine speculated that episode 168 might have been saved on the author's laptop, and the screen was a bit like the new app she'd seen, and the room was definitely not part of the Duke's mansion. It only meant that the girl was in the passageway that connected her old world and the world of the novel. So, if she was right, it had been 10 years since Katisha's birth, and they could continue the series after her death. With admiration frozen in place, the girl guessed that she would then be able to see what would happen next in the novel. But now she remembered that she had not been mentioned, but decided to read the contents nevertheless, as she realized that there might be some important information about the family's future in the work. Now the heroine decided to check the following episodes on the author's laptop to find out what happened to Neela. Eventually, she was able to find the sequel and started reading. The heroine learned that there was one last step left as Neela approached the top of the hero's spirit tower and thought about the fact that if she took the sword and saved Ikal, it would be over. At that moment, tears came to the eyes of the main character of the novel because she guessed that she could escape from those damned Vasco. This episode greatly impressed the girl, who jumped up and down in anticipation of the punishment of this family. After reading some more, the heroine guessed that this was the ending she wanted so much. So she decided to continue reading and learned that there was one last door left in front of Neela, but at the end of the stairs stood someone he didn't expect to see at all. Now the novel's protagonist saw Ikal before her, who should have been consumed by the demonic sword. But he did not rush to answer her series of questions and instead asked his own. Looking at the girl strangely and holding out a piece of paper to her, the boy inquired if she knew the woman, but at the same moment the affair ended. When she received the notification that there was no next episode, the girl froze in place with horror, but immediately approached the screen with indignation, noticing that her name appeared on it. Looking for the next episode, the heroine began frantically clicking around the screen, but no matter how much she did, nothing appeared, so she decided to find a way out of here first. A while later, tiredly falling to the ground, the girl covered her face with her hands in despair because she realized that there was no door in this room. Turning around and looking again at the box she woke up in, the heroine assumed she could get back the same way. Climbing into the cramped structure, the girl shrank back, afraid that she wouldn't make it. She was very worried because she couldn't abandon her millions and die here. Guessing that there was no other option, the girl began begging all her relatives, as well as those she didn't know, to let her return to the affair. Eventually, a few moments later, the heroine woke up on her bed and guessed that she was able to return to the novel, though she had time to think that she was going to die in that trap. Tiredly panting and looking at the pendant in horror, the girl wondered what it was and how Ikal had managed to get out of the sword he was locked in. However, there was another issue that bothered the heroine greatly, and that was that she couldn't understand who had the idea to add the name of a background character who had no role in the novel. The next morning, going to the window and sweetly stretching, the heroine realized that she was very tired because she had visited that place hundreds of times until the morning came, but she never found the next episode. However, looking at the pendant again, the girl realized that there was good news, which was that she was able to watch the previous episodes and realized what test the Duke was talking about. Now the girl knew that at the clan meeting, to which members of the main and side families usually came to decide Vlasco's most important matters, different people arrived. But if a representative and responsible person had to be chosen, he or she had to pass a qualified test. Nila was helping the current Duke, Lucius Vlasco, that day, and accidentally began to resonate with the sword. And afterwards, a family meeting was to decide her fate, and she was asked to take the test. In the case of the protagonist, everything will also be decided by the meeting, which means that she might not even be given a chance and killed without regret, because that's the easiest way to destroy the terms of the will. Nila had tried her best to get a chance to complete this quest, so now the protagonist realized that everything was very similar, and apparently she had become the girl's replacement. Standing in the room that connects the world of the novel to her real world, the heroine looked at the monitor and guessed that Nila would be joining this family in the fall in 5 years. However, what worried the protagonist was that the years didn't match, because Nila wasn't connected to the inheritance, so she wasn't a replacement. But no sooner had she thought about it than she found herself back on her bed. Looking around frightened, the girl guessed that it was due to the time limit again, and the recovery time was 6 hours, so she wouldn't be able to enter there for now. It seemed to the protagonist that it didn't feel like time was basically passing in that room, and she also still didn't understand how she got there or what kind of place it was, the writer's unconsciousness or his head. Tiredly grabbing her head, the girl guessed that everything was very complicated, because she still couldn't understand why the main character was looking for her and whether she was going to be some important secondary character. The protagonist realized that her fate depends on the creator, who is not even in this dimension. So, going to the window and looking hopefully at the street, she began to beg the creator not to make her an enemy of Nila. Sometime later, when the girl came to dinner, she was served the dish she had ordered, for which she immediately thanked her chef, calling it the best. With her head saddened, the girl admitted that this food reminded her of Grandpa Hertzen, though she really just wanted to eat it. Hearing the best compliment, the chef, looking at the lady with recognition, declared that in that case he would try even harder, which pleased the lady very much, so that she explained that trying was something that only a man could do. Looking at his guest with his former equanimity, the Duke guessed that she was very much at ease in this house, but she should not hope that he would soon be hers. Facing the Duke's gaze, the lady hurriedly lowered her head in embarrassment, but immediately added quietly that if the will went into effect, the house could be hers. The man had heard her words, so now, looking at her with more hatred, he guessed that she could adapt quickly, and it was probably his father's upbringing, for she had already lost all fear. Looking at the Duke with confusion, the girl wondered if she should be afraid of him, to which he replied that he did not mean it at all, and now she decided that she should be confident because she was a rich man who knew her future. With a sly smile, the Duke explained that he thought that, judging by her courage, she would easily survive in this difficult world, so he should probably take all the money away from her and send her away right now. Pale with horror, the heroine explained to her interlocutor that she had a weak stomach, so she needed to eat good food and see good things. Not taking her words seriously, the man asked her to stop talking nonsense and just eat. An awkward silence hung in the room for a moment, which the Duke interrupted by asking the girl if her father cooked her food, which she confirmed, but realized herself that he was actually buying it. Suddenly a thought occurred to the Duke, which he wanted to voice, but immediately changed his mind. Now the girl looked at him with a questioning look and guessed that she wanted to ask about his family. Deciding to start from afar, the heroine explained that sometimes her grandfather would tell her about his children and grandchildren and mention that they had had a big fight, so now the Duke wondered if she wanted to know why that had happened. Faced with the Duke's frightened stare, the girl waved her hands in embarrassment and explained that she didn't mean that at all, but she was worried that her grandfather looked very lonely without his family, who had forgotten about him. According to the heroine, her grandfather made a sad face every time he talked about his family, and maybe he took her in because he couldn't handle the loneliness. Without noticing a drop of pity on the Duke's face, the heroine was indignant, guessing that if he knew he was in such a critical condition, he could have visited him at least once. After listening to the main character's story, the man asked why she was looking at him like that, and then added that it was his father who had abandoned Vlasco's family and him, so such a gap could not be filled by one short meeting. Now the hero has realized that her existence to the Duke is like a debt of 300 million that her father dumped on her in a past life, which is the act of an irresponsible parent who left such an inheritance. Sighing tiredly, the man admitted that his father himself had abandoned his own family and raised another child, so there was nothing he could do about it. After listening to the man's story, the girl guessed that she herself would like to be rid of such a fate, and now, striking her hand on the table, she lost her temper, for the thought of the past was driving her mad. Looking at her interlocutor with irritation, the girl assumed that he wanted to grab her father by the collar and shake him well, scold him, wipe him off the face of the earth, destroy him, forget him as a terrible dream. The girl's assumption greatly frightened the Duke, so that, looking at her with consternation, he explained that it was not so serious, but, bowing her head before her new acquaintance, the heroine promised to leave at once when they settled the question of the inheritance. Looking at his guest with surprise, the man guessed that she had changed her attitude in just one night and her ambition had disappeared somewhere, to which she replied that her plans had been small from the beginning, for she had had enough of her grandfather's 3-story house in Telfar. Hearing the confession of her interlocutor, the Duke asked if she meant that old ruin, in which it was impossible to turn around without hitting anything, to which, grinning, she replied that she was not going to put 30 people there. Now it seemed to the heroine that her interlocutor behaved like the director of a huge company, but did not even know how much it cost to hire a carriage, and he in turn, again watching her a little, guessed that she was not afraid of him at all, but at first trembled. The Duke laughed, and the girl looked at him with surprise and realized it was the first time she had seen such behavior. So she explained that she was scared, but he is her grandfather's son. The bedrooms here are comfortable, the food is delicious, and also she doesn't get beaten so she can relax. Upon hearing the woman's statement, the man asked why he would hit her and suggested that his father had done it to her, which the woman immediately, greatly embarrassed, denied, realizing that she was actually referring to her stepfather from a previous life. Pensively lowering her head, the girl admitted that it even freaked her out a little that they weren't hitting her, to which the man replied that she didn't have a hobby of bullying children. Now the heroine felt a little relief, but realized that if she did not pass the test, she would be kicked out of the house, and she would not have a chance to fight for the inheritance. Beginning to run his finger across the table, the Duke explained that Vlasco loved tests, and every time a search for a representative began, that representative had to pass a qualification test. According to the man, this is the choice of the uneasy elite of the most suitable person, so the side branch of the family immediately offered to deal with her, but now the situation has become annoying and chaotic, so her position is quite precarious. Clutching her dress in fright, the girl asked for a chance, explaining that she didn't want instant banishment because she thought it was too unfair, and even her grandfather wouldn't want that, so she wanted to take the test. Pensive and lowering his head, the Duke told him that the closest relatives in the branch have the most influence at the meeting, and they hold the final decision-making power. At the moment, there are 3 direct streams of Vlasco, the Duke and his children, Mr. Werner, and Mrs. Arnon. Finishing his story, the man summarized that they would hold a meeting in 15 days, so in that time, the girl should try to convince them, and if she got them on her side, he would help her too. Looking at the Duke with surprise, the heroine asked how he was going to help her. to which he replied that he would set the tone of the meeting to lead to the decision to take her test. In this way, the man intended to buy the girl some time, but, looking at her with his former guile, explained that if it was enough for the hero's spirit to wake up in time, they could change the contents of the inheritance and give Gerst to another person. Now the heroine has guessed that they can make it work if her grandfather is here, so now she has to convince Vlasko's direct descendants and get permission for the test. With an irritated look at the girl, the man asked the girl to start eating if she understood everything she was pissed off, and after she started eating, he stood up from the table. After taking a few steps and approaching the protagonist, the Duke poked her in the cheek with his finger, surprising her greatly, and then explained that he seemed to begin to understand why his father had picked her up. Not realizing what the interlocutor was getting at, the girl with her mouth full, continuing to relive her food, asked him what it meant, but the latter, without answering, laughed and declared that she was ugly. Frowning, the girl concluded that the Duke was acting like a grandfather, so it was still unclear which one was the child, but deciding to change the subject, the man informed her that Werner and Arnon would be back soon. Noticing the lady's bewilderment, the man explained that the descendants were due to arrive in 3 days, and added that they would not be as calm as he was, so she should prepare herself. As she looked away from the food, the girl realized that the Duke was not a calm person, so by the looks of it, the guests must be even more unpleasant. But the man, speaking again, asked her not to tell anyone about the inheritance and other things they had discussed. Left alone with her thoughts, the girl reached for her fork and remembered that the descendants didn't appear until the middle of the novel, so she didn't expect to see them so soon, but perhaps they had heard the story about her and were coming back to get rid of her. As she thought about it, the girl remembered that these people in the novel always stood out and had even trashier characters than the Duke. For example, the young lady said she hated to look into the eyes of people who trembled. Arnon had once chosen Neela as a sparring partner to bully her, and the young gentleman always looked indifferent and what united him, and the lady was that they hated incompetent people. And now the protagonist has come to the conclusion that she can't show her fear, and instead she has to pretend to be strong like a lion, because there are 3 days left, and it's time to figure something out. Going to the window, the Duke guessed that the arriving guest was indeed brave, for a creature that was the size of a grain and looking for a way to survive, even at this age, is capable of much. Thinking about it, the man remembered what the woman had told him about being able to carve swans out of apples, which actually surprised him, and he didn't even believe it was possible. After looking around the street, the man assumed that the father was not blind in his choice and was definitely up to something when he welcomed this little girl into the family. No matter how strong the side family was, the Duke was still the head of the family, and no one would be able to object if he promoted it. But now he was curious to see what would come out of the meeting with Werner and Arnon. The Duke wanted to see if the girl, with her dignified manners, could win the trust of people who didn't get along with anyone, even though he knew it could end badly for her. Picking up the bell and ringing it, the Duke turned to his assistant and asked him to keep an eye on Katisha, so she wouldn't be harmed when Werner and Arnon returned, to which he agreed. Looking out the window again, the man realized he couldn't believe he had to worry about his daughter and son's manners when strangers were in their home, but now it was necessary. Suddenly, there was a sudden sharp noise, and the girl, hiding behind a column, wondered what it was, but still not realizing what had happened, decided to just observe. Staring at the door, the heroine noticed that the Duke's son and daughter, Werner Vlasko, who was 17 years old, one of the 7 Aurora users in the Empire, and a strong candidate to be the next head, and Arnon Vasco, a genius, a girl who excelled in alchemy and smelting so much that she earned the title Master of the Empire, and weapons of her manufacture were breaking price records every day, had entered the mansion. The people who arrived had noble roots and natural talents, and were known for their rugged personalities. But no one would argue that they were hardworking geniuses. However, there was a problem, which was that they had almost no humanity left. Once indoors and laughing harshly, the girl wondered if the door was broken, but noticing that it was fine, she guessed that her brother had cast a reinforcement spell, which she liked a lot. Smirking, the guy explained that he had no choice, since she was puffing and yanking the handle so hard, for which the girl immediately apologized. explaining that she was ignorant and usually opened doors with her feet. Grabbing the approaching man by the scruff of the neck, the guest suggested that his sister learn to use her hands, and later, lifting the poor man up, he guessed that the abomination had snuck into the mansion, and the sister could not stay quietly in the forge. Throwing the captured man away, the guy punched the man several times and assumed that he was a spy of the imperial family, so it was worth it to make him confess who sent him here. With a grudging hum, the girl guessed that her brother was showing off again, so an altercation started between them, and the protagonist, who had been watching the whole time, remembered that the Duke had said they would be gone for 3 days, yet they were already here. After bowing to the arriving guests, the man greeted them and informed them that the Duke was waiting. But this greeting angered the girl, because her name was at the end, and she thought that the interlocutor should change the order by putting her first. After losing his temper and turning away from his sister, the boy announced that he would not go with her and would visit the bathroom first, much to the embarrassment of the aide, who stated that the Duke wanted to see them immediately upon arrival to discuss something. With a hateful look at the aide, the guy repeated that he was going to the bathroom and would not accept any objections, which he had to agree to. The girl smirked, noting that her character was definitely better than her brother's, but turning to the assistant as well, she informed him that she would stop by to see her father after she returned from the forge. As she left the mansion, the girl threw her hands up in joy, guessing that it was time to sharpen her blades and she should make a sword as cool as Gerst. The protagonist, who still hadn't shown herself to the guests, turned pale with horror and realized that if she went to them without preparing herself, she would be trampled and she wouldn't even have time to make a peep. The girl now realized that she had to gather information, so she immediately dashed in the other direction, but peered through the ajar door and ran into the Duke's son. The protagonist did not expect to see a guest in front of her, so, looking at him frightened, wondered what she should do now. But he, not embarrassed, asked why she was standing and allowed her to pass. Immediately turning away, the guy asked the girl to prepare his bath, check the water temperature, and bring him a towel and everything else, which the girl had to agree to, finding the situation strange. Now the girl remembered that when Neela had first come to this house, Werner had ordered her to work around the house and clean here and there, and afterward he would find every possible fault in her cleaning and punish her mercilessly if she didn't get it done in 3 minutes. Glancing at the clock that stood nearby, the protagonist noticed that 30 seconds had already passed, so she should start as soon as possible. She now guessed that the guest had decided to mock her right away, so she shouldn't let herself be bullied. The task did not frighten the heroine because she was not equal in cleaning, so she immediately rushed to get a bucket and soon finished the duties. Werner, who had been lying on the couch all this time, looked around and admitted that she had cleaned up pretty well, which meant that her training hadn't gone to waste. The guy now ordered the heroine to clean the room while he washed, as there was a lot of dust, to which she agreed, calling her master because she decided not to take any chances. With a relieved sigh, the heroine assumed the guest would be bathing for about 20 minutes, so now it was time for her to show off her skills and polish everything up. Sometime later, when the arrival had left the bathroom, he looked around and noted that the room was perfectly clean, so he turned to his assistant and asked her name. With an acknowledging look at the young man, the heroine introduced herself as Katisha Ainsley, and the man, after a bit of hesitation, admitted that he liked her speed as well as the fact that she didn't look scared. Bowing embarrassed, the girl thanked the gentleman for the compliment and was very surprised that he was satisfied, remembering that it had taken Neela 5 years to gain his favor. In fact, the protagonist didn't think it was so easy to win his favor, so she even assumed it was some sort of test, but was once again distracted from her thoughts by the Lord's voice. Taking a cup of tea, the guy asked the girl how long she had been living in this mansion, to which she immediately replied that she had arrived here 4 days ago. Now the lad guessed that in such a case, the girl must have seen the swindler who had embezzled 2/3 of Lasco's assets in one night. This assumption of the gentleman greatly frightened the protagonist. Because she thought that he was so mocking the heiress, however, now she guessed that he accepted her maid. Looking at the girl with interest, the boy asked the girl what the heiress looked like and added that he had heard she was like a dried plum picked from the ground. Severely embarrassed, the girl admitted that at first glance the heiress looked normal. She didn't dare to tell the Lord the truth because she simply couldn't admit it at such a moment. Noticing the gentleman's surprise, the girl also added that she did not think she had any strong ambition to take possession of anything, but the latter, grinning, inquired how the snake who had caused such a will to be written could have no ambition. With irritation, Werner put the cup on the table so that the tea even spilled out of it and admitted that he couldn't stand to see others trying to take over other people's things for which they hadn't even lifted a finger. Clamming up in embarrassment, the heroine explained that she thought the heiress had no choice, which the guy immediately confirmed, since the contract was certified by magic and couldn't be destroyed. Now, the guest suggested that instead of getting rid of the contract, they should deal with the heiress herself, which frightened the protagonist even more, and she turned pale that horror. Looking at the girl suspiciously, the guy assumed that if the heiress had gotten this far, she was ready to compete with him, which meant that she was definitely not an easy person. He didn't really understand how she was able to deceive her grandfather, but he wanted to get a confession and kick her out. According to the guy, if this rogue was in any way related to the imperial family, this matter needed to be resolved immediately. Noticing her excitement, the guest asked if she had already spoken to the fox and then explained that she could let her guard down before the child, so she should pretend to be her friend and spy on her to find out her thoughts and plans. With an embarrassed smile and a pleading look at the Lord, the girl explained that she was very new here, so this task was too difficult for her. But he explained that she was the only maid who could hold a conversation with him for 10 minutes. Also, smiling sweetly, the guy admitted that the main character was the first child to look at her that way, and he liked the fact that she didn't look like a battered chick. Looking at the guest in surprise, the girl assumed that she liked him and also remembered that he always preferred strong and confident people. Werner again took the protagonist out of her thoughts by asking if she agreed with his proposal, and she immediately realized that, apparently, the idea of revealing her identity and gaining favor had failed, so she could try to build up the trust of the maid and the master between them so that she would not be chased away even if the truth was revealed. Looking at the Lord, the girl declared that he could rely on her, and the Lord, smiling sweetly, handed her a sweet, asking her to eat it and not be cranky, as she needed her strength to study. Looking at the girl again, the Lord added that if she did well, she would receive additional payment, but the heroine would like to take it in years of life rather than money. Having met the lady in the morning, the Duke's aide and Keith, the Duke's personal guard, greeted her and, guessing that she had come very early, inquired what had brought her to this dangerous place. Smiling sweetly, the girl threw her hands up happily and enthusiastically announced that she had come to greet the Duke, much to the amusement of the guard, who had not expected that they would have someone to greet the Lord in the morning. After hearing the purpose of the girl's arrival, the Duke asked his guard to take the girl to the dining hall, so the girl smiled embarrassedly and immediately guessed that he had excellent hearing. Entering the Duke's room, the lady greeted him and offered him breakfast, but he refused, explaining that he did not want to, so she could go and eat by herself. Lowering her gaze, the girl informed her interlocutor that it was very lonely and sad to eat breakfast by herself, for she was accustomed always to eat with her grandfather, which greatly strained the Duke. Peeking through the ajar door, the gentleman's guard reminded him that he had eaten dinner in his office yesterday, and his assistant added that he hadn't slept in 3 days, so he needed to make time for normal meals. Now the protagonist, whom the boys had helped, was very grateful to them, but even this did not work on the man, so he, distracted by the papers, said that he had no time to go downstairs so they should eat themselves. Greatly embarrassed, the girl suggested that she would have to retreat. But at the same moment, the cook who had burst into the room to see the gentleman shouted that he simply could no longer calmly observe his bad eating habits, as it was a disregard for his labor. Frightened, frozen in place, and then sighed tiredly, the Duke had to admit that he had no allies left in this house, so the girl, guessing that everyone was on her side, asked him to eat together right there. When the table was set and people began to eat, the Duke guessed that the guest could not even eat properly, which she immediately confirmed, explaining that she was still a child. Turning her attention to the Duke, the girl noticed that he was so busy looking at papers even while eating, but at the same moment the man looked away and inquired how she was doing in gaining his children's trust. Glancing again at the girl, who was now drinking her tea, the man confessed that so far he saw only her care for herself to which she replied, lowering her gaze, that she had her own methods, for she realized that she must not be told that she had been mistaken for a maid. With a stern look at her interlocutor, the man ordered the girl to always go to meet his children only when accompanied by an adult. And if she felt that they were in a bad mood, she should run here. Noticing the heroine's surprise, the man explained that she didn't need to get hurt on the spot, and she immediately guessed that it bothered him that he'd thrown her to those puppies. With an acknowledging look at the Duke, the girl promised to come running for rescue if she was frightened, to which he agreed, and then, after patting her on the head, asked her to leave if she had already eaten. Confused, the heroine guessed that the Duke had waited for her to finish, which confirmed that sometimes he was surprisingly caring. Now, she even thought that maybe if she had a father, he would treat her the same way. When the protagonist approached Margaret, the maid, the latter explained to her that the young gentleman was now in the training center, and after answering the girl's question, told her that the guy had a tendency to be aggressive during training, so it was better not to risk it. The maid, noticing the girl's disappointment, offered to go together if she needed to see him, which pleased the little girl so much that she even jumped up and down with impatience. When the protagonist followed the maid, she began to shake with horror because there was an eerie atmosphere, as if there were hundreds of needles flying through the air. Suddenly, the girl felt a strange energy and grabbed Margaret by her dress and explained that they had better leave as this blue energy was hurting her. No sooner had the girl returned back than the blue energy became even stronger, so that it almost swept her off her feet, and the maid, frightened, grabbed her in her arms and asked her to hold on tight. When the maid jumped up, the heroine guessed they were moving away from the ground. She now realized that her acquaintance was definitely not the most common maid, and her wrist and ankle thingies resembled workout gear. As the attendant and the girl lowered herself to the ground, the latter realized that there were a lot of unique people here. However, interrupting her musings, the maid asked if she was surprised and afterwards explained that this was everyday life for them. Taking a look, the protagonist immediately rushed to grab the attendant's dress, because she now noticed that there were only ruins around, which meant that Werner was training very aggressively. Now the girl realized that such a blow of the guy would kill even a bear, but looking more closely, she noticed that, besides Werner, there was someone else there, which scared her even more. The protagonist guessed that she was Arnon, whose beauty struck her even more, but at the same moment, her brother came up to her and looked at her with contempt and said that she was of no use, because she was not learning anything at all. Freaking out, the girl asked him to shut up, and afterward assumed that he had definitely cast a reinforcing spell or she had just eaten something wrong. With an embarrassed smile, the maid covered the protagonist's ears and explained that it was better for her not to hear it, and she now realized that her guest's mouth was not so pretty. 3 years ago, Arnon was considered a great swordsman and could have been Werner's equal, but morale can't trump injury. So, when she suffered a fractured right shoulder and a wound to her leading arm, the gap between brother and sister began to widen. Due to her injury, the girl had to change direction and try to surpass her injury with a sword reinforcement, and now she is only 15 years old, but she already holds a key position as Vlasko's blacksmith. That was all the protagonist knew, but now she realized that the girl still enjoyed fighting, because she fought with such fury even though there was a difference in skills. However, the girl now received another blow from her brother and found herself thrown backwards, so he approached her and explained that it was important to train her body well. After analyzing her fight, her brother concluded that the right side of her body was constantly open, so she was narrowing the range of motion of her shoulder, and if she held the sword with her left hand and neglected her right hand, she would hurt herself. Shrinking in surprise, the protagonist guessed that this was the truest character assassination, and her brother couldn't say such a thing if he knew about the injury. The words of the interlocutor took the girl out of her mind, so that now even the protagonist and the maid felt that a strange atmosphere hung, and a few moments later the girl's attendant explained that the mistress had been injured in the past, but the master did not know about it. The maid said that the girl stated that she would kill anyone who tried to blab about it, so the misunderstanding between them was only growing. Now the protagonist has learned the truth and realized that Werner is very stupid, since he does not know about such things, and his sister will not tell, because it would hurt her pride. With a disdainful look at his sister, he asked her to think less about strengthening the sword and concentrate on muscles, strength, and agility. Because if she continued like this, she wouldn't be able to defeat him in 10 years. The girl glanced at her interlocutor and asked him to stop showing off, explaining that she was just unlucky, and then turned around and headed in the other direction. The girl felt sorry for Werner for speaking his thoughts honestly, but every time it would crack her sister's pride. She even remembered that it was said that their relationship was the cruelest of all Vlasko's descendants, and apparently the reason was this. After a frightened look at the protagonist, the maid informed her that the guy's training was over, but she didn't think it was a good time to meet because the aura still hadn't completely disappeared, and the girl might get hurt. Agreeing with the maid, the protagonist asked if they could then see the young mistress, to which the latter replied that it wasn't a good choice either. With a pitying look at the maid, the protagonist explained that the girl's shoulder was probably hurting, so they could just take a look at her condition from afar. Guessing that the lady was worried about the young mistress's condition, the maid relented and allowed her to go to that one, so she immediately grabbed her in her arms and asked her to hold on tight. Following the young lady, the doctor asked to be allowed to examine her shoulder, for if it was a torn muscle, the consequences would be dreadful. But she, once more casting a displeased look at him, repeated that she did not need it. Even from a great distance, the protagonist could see that the girl's shoulder was stiff and her face was pale, which was a bad sign. But the girl, determined not to give up, forbade the doctor to tell her father or brother about it, or else he would be fired in a second. Pale with horror, the doctor was forced to agree with the girl, and she let him go a few moments later. The maid now realized that, in Arnine's case, being so stubborn was not a good idea. Leaning over to the girl and looking at her disappointedly, the maid suggested that it would be hard to see her, for she was not feeling well, and afterwards she suggested that the little girl should do something else. Looking at the attendant with surprise, the girl inquired what she proposed to do, to which she immediately replied that they could visit the garden or the exhibition halls, and that there was a savanna to the north of the grounds, where there were many interesting things to do. Imagining the huge snakes that could be in the savanna, the protagonist guessed that she simply hated such things, but after a few moments brightened up, remembering that she wanted to go shopping. Now the protagonist remembered that Vlasko's heiress must use her title at least once, so she immediately explained to the maid that she would like to go to Artyom's specialty pastry shop, as everything there must be delicious. With a confused shake of her head, the girl decided that she'd better hold back and only buy what she needed, since she had a specific goal in mind, so she decided to head to the pharmacy. Noticing the attendant's surprise, the protagonist explained that she wanted to go to Artem's best pharmacy, so the assistant immediately assumed that she was sick and reminded her that there was always a doctor on duty at the mansion. Looking worriedly at the girl, the protagonist explained that she wasn't sick at all, and afterward remembered that she had always wondered why her grandfather had taught her how to combine herbs. Her relative had told her to remember his actions better, in case she wanted to earn her own bread in the future when she didn't have extra money. So now the girl couldn't believe that her grandfather had foreseen such a thing as well. When the girl opened the door and entered the premises, she was greeted by Liliband's pharmacy, and the clerk guessed that she had come to run an errand. When the employee asked the girl how she could help her, the girl looked around and pointed her finger at all the shelves in the store and said she was ready to buy whatever they had. As preparations were being made for the meeting, the Duke inquired if the invitation for the sideline of the family had been forgotten to be sent, to which his assistant, who was already exhausted, replied that he had received the replies and all would be present. Calling his assistant a strawberry, the man asked him to cheer up, but the man was pissed off by such a nickname and asked him to stop acting like a child and clinging to his hair color. Nearly crying, the aide reminded him that he should double his salary, since he not only handles the finances but also serves as secretary. The Duke asked the boy to stop talking nonsense and asked if he was following the girl, which he immediately confirmed, saying that she had gone to town today. Looking at the gentleman with surprise, his assistant noticed that he had been unusually kind to her these past few days. It seemed strange to him that the cold man cared so much for the girl. Noticing that his assistant was staring at him, the Duke asked him to stop staring at him and get to work, explaining that if he miscalculated, he would cut his salary, so he had to leave. Having set the seal, the Duke guessed that this was his last task for the day, and afterwards decided to get some air, but when he approached the window, He froze fearfully in place. Looking closely, the man saw 2 wagons in the yard and wondered what they were, and in the meantime, the girl who had bought up all the drugstore remarked that overspending was a lot of fun. Now it was clear to the protagonist why people do such things, because the mere sight of these bags made her feel good, and she decided to get to work. The main character worked through the night, and after getting distracted from her work, she guessed that she had to hurry up or she would be late for breakfast. Sitting at the table across from the girl, the Duke asked her what she had been doing yesterday, to which she replied that she had just been playing in her room, but the interlocutor already knew that she had been busy with herbs. The girl wondered how he knew about it, to which the interlocutor replied that she smelled of herbs, and it would be strange not to feel it. Greatly embarrassed, the girl explained that yesterday Werner and Arnon had a sparring session, and she thought that the girl had hurt herself. These words greatly frightened the Duke, who reminded the girl that she had even seen a doctor. Guiltily lowering his eyes, the Duke guessed that his daughter was very stupid for not saying anything. So now the girl explained that was why she wanted to meet her. After showing the Duke the gift she had made, the protagonist explained that the box contained 200 servings of herbal juice for Arnon, much to the Duke's surprise because it was too much. Noticing the not-so-positive reaction of her interlocutor, the girl guessed that he was upset because she didn't give him anything, but she was ready for such a case, so she immediately handed him the vial, explaining that it was worth drinking its contents with warm water if he was going to stay awake at night, as it would help him concentrate. Accepting the girl's gift, the man was greatly surprised that she wanted to make him a pleasure, and then guessed that she had given him a tincture that restores strength. Refuting the Duke's assumptions, the girl explained that it was caffeine, an ultimatum stimulant not even comparable to tea, so that he could get the week's work done in one day. Seizing the excited girl, the Duke a few moments later hurriedly carried her to the exit of the room and asked her to leave, much to her embarrassment. Looking at the door that closed behind her, the girl assumed that her interlocutor wanted a tincture of restoration, but guessing that he was very over the top, she decided to ignore it and go to Arnon. When the girl arrived at the forge, she guessed that the one looked just like the one described in the novel, and walking a little further, she spotted the girl herself. It had been a full day since she had been injured, but the poor thing's shoulder was still hurting because apparently she hadn't been treating it. So now the heroine realized that if she just tolerated it, trouble might start. Approaching the victim and touching her shoulder, the girl offered to take what she had brought, but the girl was frightened by such a spontaneous visit and turned around and screamed in terror. In fact, the protagonist was as frightened as the guest, but immediately realized that she had startled her and hurriedly explained that she had an herbal medicine that reduced swelling and pain so it could be used as a quick painkiller. Severely embarrassed and waving her hands in confusion, the girl had promised her interlocutor that there was no poison there, and now Arnon remembered that yesterday someone had said that there was a stray cat climbing on the roof, so most likely it was her new acquaintance. With a wary look at the main character, the girl confesses that she has never seen her before, but she realizes that only one new person could have recently appeared in the mansion. Rising from her chair, Arnon looked threateningly at the girl, so that she realized that her interlocutor was very tall. And afterwards, the girl guessed that apparently she was the one mentioned in her grandfather's meeting and should be the heiress. Swallowing nervously and looking at her interlocutor, the girl confirmed her hunch by introducing herself as Katisha Ainsley, which made her hesitate. Deciding not to resist, the girl used the potion the girl had brought and immediately noticed the pain was gone, so thanked her for her help. Bowing appreciatively, the girl guessed that her new acquaintance thanked her very calmly and afterward explained that she was the one to thank. In fact, the protagonist was sure that the guest would be more aggressive towards her, but at the same moment, she tensed up and wondered why she was looking at her like that. The girl looked fearfully at her interlocutor and asked if she would be angry, to which the girl replied that she wasn't going to fight with a child the size of a mouse, but her brother apparently did, which meant that he was on the verge of threatening his place as successor. Looking away, the girl admitted that the Duke had warned her about it, but she couldn't refuse the inheritance even if she wanted to, which the girl understood, and, covering her eyes, explained that they were worried about the family's reputation. Now the interviewee admitted that she didn't care because nothing would go to her anyway, as she was pushed to the last place and would not inherit it. Pointing at the girl, she explained that there was no problem with the ball, but there was a problem with other things, namely the fact that grandfather's vault must have a lot of rare materials such as magic enhancement stones, dwarf gloves, and other reinforcement materials. Tensing up, the girl admitted that she had hoped her father and brother would one day pass them on to her. But now, it would all be eaten by the protagonist. And she added that the sword didn't concern her, but the rest did, and especially her grandfather's vault. With a hateful look at the girl, Arnon stated that she wouldn't take anything since the safe belonged to her, but the protagonist realized it was a great strategic point, and tensing up, offered the girl a deal. Looking at the protagonist with bewilderment, her interlocutor asked her what she meant, to which she replied that she had a suggestion that would make them happy. And it was that she should take her side so that she could pass the heiress test and protect her so that everything would go to her. Looking at the girl with irritation, the guest wondered if she even realized who she was talking to, and then explained that she had proclaimed with such pride that she would take the inheritance from her, a direct descendant of Vlasco. Trying to chase away the fear, the girl explained that the will says she is the rightful heir, so she will have many enemies when she receives the inheritance, but she is going to invest in it. Noticing her interlocutor's surprise, the girl reminded her that she needed storage, so she could get it and give her everything she needed. And when she started her own workshop, she could support it with both materials and startup finances. Perplexed, the girl wondered when she knew that she wanted to open a workshop because it was her longtime dream, which she had never told anyone about. But interrupting her thoughts, the girl asked how she felt about the idea, which would work if she inherited everything safely. The girl looked questioningly at her new acquaintance and wondered if she wanted to say that she would help her with everything, but she immediately realized that if she didn't take the vault, it would be in her father's hands first, and only then it would be her and her brother's turn. But that would take at least 20 years, and she would have to share everything with her brother. Determined to push the girl to a decision, the protagonist reminded the one that they have nothing to lose, so she offers to sign the contract right now and has already brought it with her. The guest was very surprised that her new acquaintance had already prepared a contract, but without answering her question, she pointed to the place where to sign. And the girl immediately guessed that it was, apparently, a toy contract. Tiredly covering her eyes, the girl came to the conclusion that the child remains a child, although the proposal sounds favorable, but the girl also explained that then they would go together to notarize it first to the administration office, then to the legal department, and then to the Bureau of Magic Management. Noticing the girl's surprise, the girl explained that no one would destroy the statement, just like the girl's will, and the interlocutor, listening to her all this time, could not believe that she was exactly 10 years old. A while later, walking down the palace corridor, the girl guessed that she had succeeded. In fact, the girl said she would think about it, but it was clear from her face that she was in a good mood. The protagonist recalled that in the novel, Arnon opened a workshop 5 years later, but the items were identical to those sold by the Vlasco family, so they didn't attract much attention. With a saddened, lowered head, the girl guessed that, apparently, the character of her acquaintance was getting tougher because of it, but she was not sure how much she could trust the original, because when they met, they seemed to her quite different people. The protagonist now realized that everyone in the mansion was friendly and wondered if Neela got along with them too, which didn't fit the content of the novel. When the protagonist came to the gentleman, he looked at her strangely and noticed that she had come very late, and she now noticed that her new acquaintance's brother was also different from what he was in the novel. Looking questioningly at the girl, the boy inquired what she could report, but she took the time to answer his question and pointed out that he had hurt himself, which he immediately confirmed, explaining that it had happened in sparring with his sister. After looking at the young man's trauma, the protagonist admitted that she thought the skills of the one were better, so she suggested he be gentler with his sister. The girl's proposal made the guy mad, and he hurriedly reminded her that they should always be ready to put their lives on the line, because it is worth it to relax, as the girl will cut off her ankles. Now the protagonist realized that brother and sister are not the least bit different and are crazy. Taking a cup of tea and lowering his head thoughtfully, the boy told the girl that his sister was very skillful with the ball and a master of her level was giving his best, so he had to respond in kind. When he finished his story, he summarized that it should be considered a courtesy to those people who would devote their entire lives to the sword. And most importantly, the heroine thought it a surprise that he thought so much of his sister. In fact, the guy thought it was strange because before she was more sincere, but now something has changed. So the heroine, noticing all the anxiety, hastened to calm him down, explaining that she definitely does not hate him, but seems to think as much as he does about her. Smiling, the interlocutor decided not to argue with the protagonist, because he realized that they would still remain brother and sister until the very end. But still, he planned to challenge his lordship if he could defeat the girl. Now the guy realized that with the leg injury he had, he wouldn't be able to do that, and the girl was obviously aiming there on purpose. Looking at the boy in surprise, the girl asked him why he didn't call the Duke father, to which the boy, greatly embarrassed, replied that he just didn't feel like he was really his father. After thinking about it, the heroine remembered that she had never seen them together. So maybe it was awkward for her interlocutor to say it. And after all, they had lived apart for a long time, so she immediately hurried to explain that it was not strange at all, and all families have different circumstances. Lowering her head, the girl told her new acquaintance that she herself had been adopted, but she had been fortunate enough to meet a kind person whose attention she did not deserve. Namely, it was her grandfather, whom she now missed very much. Covering her eyes and smiling sweetly, the guy explained that she was wrong, because in this life, everything is given for a reason, and if she met a good man, she was good, because life is not so easy to be kind to those who do not deserve it. Finally, the interlocutor wished the girl to be more confident, so that she almost cried when she heard such words from him, but decided to confine herself to the usual gratitude. The Duke thoughtfully froze in place and asked if the girl really felt the flow of aura, which his interlocutor confirmed, explaining that the little girl felt it with her whole body and it seems even saw it with her own eyes. Thinking about it, the Lord realized that such a thing was hard to achieve even with 5 years of training, and a child couldn't sense aura. Even though she was already 10 years old, she was too young for it. In fact, the maid who came to see the Duke realized that the girl was indeed small when compared to the Duke's strong children. What actually surprised the man was that the girl could read at 10 and could do things that her son, who had held a sword since he was 11, could not, and the maid added that she was nimble and her presence was hardly felt. In addition, the girl was able to hide even from the lord and lady, and now the Duke, leaning back in his chair, realized that the child without training could see the aura and hide presence, which was very unusual because it was the first time he met a case similar to his. Smiling, the Duke suggested that it was all about talent, which meant that they had a brilliant child dropped on their heads from somewhere and needed to find information about her parents. Fearfully frozen in place, the Duke even assumed that the protagonist was a spy. He thought so because he remembered that last year there had been a 13-year-old maid. With a suspicious look at the maid, the Duke suggested that those specially chose such a small, delicate cutie that even suspicion does not appear, to which the interlocutor replied that she did not know whether the spy or not, but really cute. Sighing tiredly, the Duke summed up that everyone fell for the girl's trick, but the maid reminded him that someone was having breakfast with the lady for the 5th day, so he immediately realized that she was impressively easy to trust. Thinking, the man said that her fate would soon be decided because they would be visited by important guests, so the assistants should prepare everything, and he wondered whether the girl would be able to convince his children. In fact, the Duke was not sure that she could cope with the pressure at the meeting because she was very small. A while later, the girl was carving apples and asked the maid how soon the family meeting would be, to which she replied that it was the first time a meeting of this magnitude had been held in 10 years. Still not getting an answer to her question, the girl hurriedly asked again, to which the maid replied that it was said that something would begin immediately after the arrival of Elder Gespa, the younger brother of the previous Duke. Realizing that the meeting would begin very soon, the girl sped up and began to carve swans out of apples. But she was greatly troubled by the fact that she was not yet ready to confess to Werner. Looking at the apple swans the girl had made, the maid marveled and praised her. adding also that she could not believe that she was so skillful at that age, but the girl could even carve roses. Looking closer, the assistant assumed that the lady had a talent for wielding a knife, which made the lady very confused and a little upset because she realized that these tricks were not going to help her survive in this house and it couldn't be delayed any longer, so it was time to confront Werner. When the girl came again to the young gentleman's room, she greeted him and offered him a snack of apples, so that the latter, distracted from reading and looking at her with surprise, inquired if she had made them herself, which she immediately confirmed and added that she wanted to give them to him personally. Sighing tiredly, the gentleman guessed that he was dealing with a maid who cleaned and helped in the kitchen, so she should ask for an increase in her salary, because Vlasco appreciated the labor and was willing to pay for it. Covering her face with the tray, the girl guessed that she wasn't a maid and it was time to admit it, and at the same moment, the guy asked her to sit down so she could read him the report when he finished the task. Looking closer, the girl noticed that the young gentleman was reading a book on the politics of the empire, so, judging from the way things were organized, he was interested in arguing about the process of founding the noble council. Now the heroine remembered what her grandfather had taught her, that it was better to look at examples of other countries. So, after stepping back a bit, she found a book called A Political History of the Continent, and wondered if she should show the chapter on the noble council of a neighboring kingdom. Approaching the boy, the girl handed him a book, and the latter, accepting it, thanked that help, but immediately guessed that it was very complicated. Frightened and frozen in place, the guy looked at the girl with bewilderment and asked if she had read the book, which the girl confirmed by saying that she had read it about a year ago. Now her interlocutor guessed that she had read this difficult book at the age of 9, and the girl, still not answering his question, decided that it was time to confess. Looking into the young gentleman's room, the maid noticed that he was busy and apologized for disturbing him, but reminded him that it was lunchtime, so she was looking for the young lady. Hearing the maid call the girl a young mistress, the lad inquired who she was talking about, but not the least bit embarrassed, the guest explained that she was right in front of him. Looking at the girl in surprise, the guy at first didn't even believe it was true, and the maid immediately apologized to the guys for not having time to introduce them to each other. Grabbing the girl and smiling sweetly, the maid explained that this was Lady Katisha Ainsley, the protagonist of the late Duke's will, who had arrived at their door a week ago. The guy got mad and asked her why she pretended to be a maid, which scared her a lot, but she said that she did not do it on purpose, but just missed the right moment to tell the truth. Looking at the girl with hatred, the boy guessed that the last few days had been a game, but the girl, pale with horror and almost crying, said that she didn't mean it, but was just afraid that he would get angry if she told the truth. Hitting his fist on the table, the young lord assumed it was a joke, for now he was ashamed of having laid everything out to her and even the situation with her father, so realizing there was no other option, the girl began to bow to him as well and beg his forgiveness. Tensing up in style, the protagonist confessed that she had accidentally concealed her identity, but she wasn't lying and didn't want to offend him, so if he could listen to her circumstances, she would tell him everything. Tiredly clutching his head, the young gentleman asked the girl to wait a little, because he could not put it all in his head. But she immediately hurried to explain that she was not a bad person, but just a misunderstanding. Interrupting the acquaintance, the guy asked to be quiet for a second, but she spoke again, calling him a young gentleman, which pissed him off even more, and he asked not to be called that as it confused him. Looking guiltily at the boy, the girl assumed that was the problem and wondered if he didn't like the address. However, guessing that he did indeed, she asked what she should call him. Strongly embarrassed and looking at the girl without his previous hatred, the gentleman allowed her to call him whatever she wanted and explained that his name was Werner Vlasco. Smiling sweetly, the girl called her interlocutor by name, but the one who did so was indignant because she completely lost respect. And after all, he was older than her, but he himself did not give her an answer to her question, so she decided to call him brother. Strongly indignant, the fellow picked up the lady and carried her with him, but the lady, terribly frightened and beginning to twitch, declared that she was not a swindler, for she had lived with her grandfather for 10 years. Realizing that her words did not convince her brother, the girl began to apologize to him, calling him the most beautiful and begging him not to bury her under the mountain, to which he said nothing, but looked at her tiredly and asked her to be quiet, or he would shut her mouth. When the lad came to the Duke's room, the latter, looking at him irritably, asked him to knock before entering anyone's room, to which the latter replied that it did not matter now, for he resented the fact that he had said nothing to him. Now the lad explained that it was impossible to recognize the girl in this form, for she had a very strange outfit. Much embarrassed, the heroine said hello to the Duke, and the latter inquired who had dressed her in it. Looking closer, the Duke guessed that the girl looked like a rainbow, and wondered why her outfit was so strange if the maid was supposed to fill her closet with clothes. With her head down guiltily, the girl admitted that she had a lot of clothes in her closet, but right now she was wearing a dress her grandfather had given her, and it was her favorite, so she wore it because she missed it. When the protagonist admitted that it was a gift from her older relative, the men froze in surprise. But the first to break the silence was the Duke, who said he loved bright colors. His words really surprised his son, but the gentleman immediately explained that clothes should stand out, and the harmony between top and bottom is impressive, so they are clearly talking about different outfits. Turning to his son again, the man inquired why the latter was so bothered by it, but the latter, with an irritated sigh, agreed that his grandfather had peculiar but sensual tastes. Looking at the guy indignantly, the protagonist recalled that a couple minutes ago he had said she looked like a beggar, and now he had stated that the king would shine even in rags, and most likely her grandfather wanted to reveal her uniqueness. The heroine still did not understand what his interlocutor was talking about, but the latter, looking down at her, guessed that he could call her unique because she had read the history of continental politics. Looking at the gentleman with astonishment, the girl wondered if it was something impressive, for her grandfather himself had said that only ignoramuses did not know about such things. Hearing the guest's statement, the Duke guessed that his father had taught the girl something that was given at the level of middle school and above academy, but that too was characterized by incredible speed of memorization and comprehension. Now the Duke realized that if one added a sense of aura and innate talent to everything enduring, it could no longer be considered an ordinary coincidence. Turning to the girl, the man informed the girl that it would be best to change into less conspicuous clothing, as he felt that Uncle Gespa would be arriving soon. Upon hearing the name Gespa Vlasco, the protagonist remembered that he was the most senior and influential figure in the family, and if he was arriving soon, it only meant that a family gathering was about to begin. As she walked down the corridor with the maid, the girl remembered that Werner had not made a sound until the very end, and she had hoped that he would at least pretend to support her. Noticing the lady's agitation, the maid asked her not to worry, explaining that Sir Gespa was not as cold as the previous gentleman, to which the lady, smiling sweetly, replied that she should not compare him to her grandfather. The protagonist guessed that if you remembered all the tricks of her grandfather, the people of this family were like a calm sour, but the maid interrupted her musings, explaining that she had to go through a door that appeared in front of them. After taking a few steps forward, the girl realized that there was nowhere else to retreat and she should try, so, coming to the door, she hurried to open it and saw a huge number of strangers in front of her, which frightened her very much. Once in the room, the protagonist looked at the guests in surprise and wondered what was going on here, for it all looked more like a trial than a meeting. Scared to look around at the people, the protagonist could not believe that about 50 people had gathered, but at the same moment she was noticed by the Duke's children, guessing that she had come. When the protagonist looked at Arnon, she smiled sweetly at her, so she took that as a good sign and decided, settling back in her chair, that she could do it and she should try harder. The people who were sitting nearby started discussing the main character and remarked that she was pathetic, petite, and thin, so she wouldn't be able to lift a sword at all, and she would be lucky if the hero's spirit didn't get enraged. Now people were discussing the fact that, apparently, the former Duke's mind began to fail in his old age, since he had picked up such an orphan, and after all, he was eccentric even in his youth, and his brothers secretly shunned him. After listening to people's reproaches, the girl lost her temper, not understanding why not only she, but also her grandfather was being insulted, so she decided to stand up for him. Speaking to the people who were sitting nearby, the girl stated that if the inheritance and the demon's sword were so important to them, they should have been around their grandfather when he was still alive. However, she had sent a letter, but no one showed up. so she was similar to them in that. And guessing that the girl had spoken, the people looked at her in surprise, amazed at her boldness. And she added that in her lifetime, they had not cared about the Duke, but now they dared to talk about the inheritance. Sighing tiredly, the girl asked how disgusting it would be for a duke to give his millions to a 10-year-old child. These words made the guests mad, so they called her a cheeky girl. Angry and pointing his finger at the protagonist, the man asked how she could judge adults if she didn't have milk on her lips, so he immediately assumed that her guardians had taught her to be so bold. Not at all embarrassed, the protagonist replied that her grandfather Herzin had taught her to respond with insult to insult. But the heroine realized that now she was finished because they could punish her for insulting the nobles, and she could do nothing, but one must not show weakness. Tensing up, the girl realized that her grandfather wouldn't let her give up, nor would he let her flaunt her weaknesses. So if she didn't, it would mean total defeat. With a hateful look at the heroine, the man said that he would like to flog such an insolent, arrogant child. This made the girl even more angry. But before she could answer anything, the Duke entered the conversation. Turning to the man who had started arguing with the girl, the Duke asked him to sit back down, because, according to him, it was not necessary to show his anger so clearly in front of the elders. Hearing the name of the interlocutor, the girl remembered that the maid had warned her about him, but now the Duke turned to her, asking her to calm down, for they were not here to share emotions. Bowing embarrassed, the girl promised her interlocutor to be more careful, and also noted that he spoke more gently to her than to the rest of the people. With an indignant sigh, the man returned to his Duke's seat again and motioned for the guests to begin the 112th meeting of the Vlasco family. Having bowed to the guests, the protagonist greeted the members of the family and the Duke, so that now the man, looking at her with interest, inquired whether she was the very heiress brought up by Herzin. Looking up excitedly and studying the older man, the girl guessed that this was the same Mr. Gespa, who now reminded her more of some mountain spirit. Turning to the Duke, the man asked if he had gathered proof that she hadn't gotten close to them to get the inheritance, which the man immediately confirmed, explaining that if there were any inconsistencies, he would have dealt with it by now. Furthermore, the Duke explained that the girl had not left Telfar, a small and remote village for which unusual visitors were a rarity, since she had been abandoned near her father's house. She had had no contact with anyone from the outside world except some of the villagers. Frowning, the old man guessed that they could at least be sure that she hadn't been sent to them by the imperial family. And after a little hesitation, he remembered that judging from the way the will had been written, his brother had been firm in his intentions. The old man realized that it was 2 or 3 months before his brother's awakening, so it would be difficult to ask him about it. So it must either be a great punishment for them, or he really believed that this girl was worthy of becoming the heiress. Looking questioningly at the protagonist, the man wanted to say something, but immediately, the disgruntled man jumped into the conversation and explained that it was more likely to be a big punishment. Noticing the bewilderment of the guests, the man reminded them that the grandfather of the protagonist had been angry when Lute had died 11 years ago. This statement made the Duke's children furious, but he went on and stated that the older man had said that he would never lay a finger on the Vlasco family again. With a hateful look at the insolent man, Werner reminded the man that he had been asked to avoid conversations that did not pertain to the topic of the meeting, so he should refrain from doing so. Strongly embarrassed and frightened, the man sank back into his seat, apologizing to the young gentleman, and the protagonist guessed that her acquaintance's mood had soured. Frowning, the Duke stated that, voluntarily or not, Katisha Ainsley could not renounce the inheritance, so the document could be invalidated in 2 cases. For example, they could wait for the previous head of the family to awaken to ask to change the heir. However, there was a second option, which was that some incident must have happened to the heiress due to which she would not be able to receive the inheritance, which scared the girl a lot. Speaking again, the man who was embittered at the protagonist passed to the conclusion that the will terminates at the death of the heir, so they shouldn't wait any longer. Embarrassed, the man admitted that, frankly, he didn't quite understand why the Duke had called this meeting. There was no need to complicate things, but now Arnon entered the conversation and asked him to shut up. The girl explained that no matter what Vlasco's reputation was, they were not beasts capable of executing an innocent child. After all, this family had chivalric roots, and even if she was a rogue, sending a child to her death would only make them worse. With a sly smile, the girl also added that she didn't think the hero's spirit would agree with this outcome of events, which was immediately confirmed to her grandfather, asking the insolent man to watch his words. Turning again to the man who had just been silenced, the girl guessed that if he wasn't interested in the sword, it was all about inheritance. But killing the girl would do nothing for him, because next in line would be the father, and then her and her brother, the direct heirs. When the girl finished her story by saying that there was no room for her uncle, he looked at her fearfully and said that he had no such intentions at all, but that he had no other options to deal with the situation. Closing his eyes and smiling, the Duke, who had everyone's attention, recalled that he had said that there were two solutions, but that wasn't quite true, and there was a way to solve everything with a more appropriate method. Frozen with anticipation, the guests began to whisper, waiting for further words of the Duke, and a few moments later, he turned to the girl and offered her to become part of the Vlasco family. The girl looked at the Duke fearfully and didn't understand what part of the family he was talking about because they hadn't agreed on that, so he explained that he was going to adopt the girl. Upon hearing his statement, the guests clutched their heads in fright and began to whisper indignantly, and the old man asked why he had such thoughts. With a sly smile and a look at the girl, the man explained that they couldn't give her the family's property so they could change her last name. The man, bursting forward, asked if that meant that she would then become the direct heiress of the family, and added that if she wanted a noble family name, another noble family would suffice. Another indignant guest confirmed the man's words and added that she would equal the status of lord and lady, but she was only a commoner with an unknown lineage. Outraged, the girl wondered why those were talking so rudely about her. She didn't want them to say stupid things, and this old man wasn't even trying to be polite. Upon reflection, the older man agreed with his guests, explaining that the man must not understand the weight of the status of the heirs of the family who carry their blood, and yet he and his children are the highest nobles of Astrock. The man added that he felt sorry for the girl, but they could only give her the surname of a distant side family, so the girl immediately shrank back, guessing that she was going to be sent to some cruel family and her future would be predetermined. Without embarrassment, the Duke explained that he was going to make her a direct heiress because he wanted to raise her on his own, but his interlocutor thought the idea was silly. Noticing the guest's bewilderment, the man explained that he was interested in raising her because she didn't seem like a problem child and had no ulterior motives. Besides, she had been valued by the previous Duke, so he was beginning to feel affection as well.